In corporate news this Monday, Champion Breweries says the listed company has received a confirmation from NGX Regulation Limited that the brewer is now in full compliance with the minimum free float requirement for companies listed on the main board of the Nigerian Exchange Limited. The regulatory arm of the NGX says Champion Breweries has successfully increased its free float to above 20%. Resulting in the removal of the company's name from the below listing standard compliance status indicator previously displayed beside the company's name across the NGX platforms. The latest development follows the recently concluded public offer and right issue of Champion Breweries PLC, which has enabled the company to meet the requirements of the exchange rules governing free float requirements well ahead of the extended deadline set by the NGX for the 31st of October this year, and which was approved by the Nigerian Exchange Group. Now, you've been briefed on that. Let's get the wider picture for the continent. The African economy is expected to grow at 4.3% in the current year, and that was in spite of the global crisis around Russia and Ukraine, the ongoing Iranian conflict, the tariff salvos of U.S. President Donald Trump, and a whole lot more. Now, that growth assessment was contained in a new report released late last week by COFACE Group, a trade risk expert company and a leading global credit insurer based in Paris. Joining me for more on this is Aroni Chaudhuri, the Africa Chief Economist at COFACE in Paris. Thank you for making the time to be on the show tonight, sir. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Good to have you. Thank you so much for coming into the show. Give me the major highlights of this new report and, of course, your optimism for Africa's growth outlook for the current year. Talk to me.
Yes, there is optimism. I will put a big if here. It is this forecast was made before the beginning of the Middle East conflict. So all of this hinges on the assumption that if the surge in oil prices remains contained in time. And on that matter, we don't have any further information for now because the conflict is just still ongoing. It's just the first week. But at least like we're seeing oil prices already spike quite hard above $100 a barrel. If it remains protracted, if there are major disruptions on oil infrastructure and/or in the Strait of Hormuz, then we could even see oil prices go to 120 or 150. And that obviously would have a major impact on the global outlook and on the outlook for the African continent. That being said, the major forces to reckon for the African growth is that you have a very big spike in the commodity prices of minerals. And so generally, when in the equilibrium of commodities, you have relatively contained food prices, relatively contained energy prices, that's where our hypothesis is, and strong mineral prices, that generally is a net positive for the continent, because obviously you have a lot of commodity exporters that will spur growth, that will spur exports. And also, if you look at the external balances, generally this means that country can build their foreign exchange reserves. It gives some breathing room for countries that have, tight financial situations, especially in terms of external debt. And so all of that gives a bit of space for the African economies to be able to bank on their other drivers, which are the drivers of domestic demand, and which those are set to remain strong because before the beginning of the conflict, inflation had been decreasing through most of the continent. There had been the chance to ease monetary policies. And also one other factor was that the dollar has weakened. And so a weaker dollar generally means stronger currencies, less imported inflation, and so basically a better environment for domestic demand. So if inflation remains contained, then the African economies would be able to benefit from both their domestic demand and the demand for their commodities. But obviously, if oil prices surge very high, except for oil exporting countries, then for most African countries, it is going to be renewed inflationary pressures. And we have seen what that leads to during the Ukraine war.
Very interesting. Let's chat a little bit to some country specifics. Which countries do you see the fastest form of growth, and what sectors are going to be the leaders? For example, your report highlighted South Africa with the mining sector leading. Look at Morocco, for example, construction. Talk to me about some of these countries that you think will be the major drivers of the growth for this year that you've seen on the continent.
So basically, in terms of regions on the African continent, there are two regions that are very dynamic in terms of growth. The first one is West Africa. So be it look, if we look at even just Nigeria, even if you put aside everything that links to oil, Nigeria has shown quite strong growth relative to previous years in 2025, and it is expected to continue simply because, I mean, the oil industry has recovered, and at the same time, we have very strong growth in the non-oil industry, especially in services such as digital services. But in West Africa, you have also strong economies like Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, which have not only access to many commodities of many types, so minerals, agro-commodity, and energy, but which also have strong domestic demand, also because these countries tend to have economic policies and industrial policies that are looking to increase private sector participation and the business environment. Senegal was also in that category before they had their hidden debt problems. So because of that, probably that the outlook has deteriorated a bit, but Senegal also remains one of these very dynamic economies of West Africa. And then in East Africa, you also have a set of very dynamic economies, the leading ones being Kenya and Tanzania, so which benefit from strong growth in the region, which also have diversified growth drivers. And for these two countries specifically, in addition to tourism, they also have large ports on the Indian Ocean. And they are kind of positioning themselves as hubs in the Indian Ocean. And so they are also developing all of the industries that are connected to this hub, the idea of hub, which is basically transport and services. And so they are going to continue to benefit, same thing, from diversified growth drivers. So this means that basically diversified economies tend to hold better, especially in this environment, which is very uncertain. But currently, commodity exporters also have some favorable tailwinds.
Yeah, okay. So, but do you remain optimistic about Africa? Of course, you mentioned earlier at the start of your comment about the current crisis in the Middle East is just starting, just about a week, about 10 days. So, even as you see one crisis on top of another, do you think that Africa will still be able to optimize a commodity resource even under the current dispensation moving forward towards the first half of the year into the rest of the current year? What's your in-house outlook at the moment? What's everybody talking about when it comes to Africa under the current crisis? What are you hearing at COFACE Group?
I mean, see, here the main concern for the African countries is that, the net energy balance of the continent is it's in a deficit. So Africa imports most of its energy. So obviously, when you have a spike in energy prices, that means that not only does it affect inflation and prices, but it also affects, generally speaking, the livelihood of millions of people. And so a sustained period of high energy prices will have significant negative impact on the continent, not only because of inflation and the impact on population, but also because you have countries that on the one hand, for oil exporters that are reliant, on oil revenues in order to finance their public deficits. And so even in a situation, if you have a spike in oil prices, which is temporary, and then oil prices drop, then that puts uncertainty even on oil exporters because they will have to make their calculations depending on these movements. And for all of the oil importers, well, if you have sustained high prices, you will have currencies that will start to depreciate. You'll have pressure on foreign exchange reserves. And we have seen in 2022 and 2023 that the level of reserves and the erosion of reserves puts some countries at major financial risk. So that is what we are going to monitor. I will say that relative to the situation that happened during the war in Ukraine, there is one, let's say, positive factor to take into account is that during the Ukraine crisis, it was both a shock on food and energy, and also 2022 and 2023 had been very hard years for the continent in terms of droughts and in terms of agricultural production. On that front, food production and food forecasts are relatively good for 2026. So even if there is a strong energy supply shocks, perhaps if food prices remain contained, then the overall shock will be a bit more, benign than what it was during the Ukraine war, in which case the growth drivers would continue to function better and we would see momentum despite the fact that obviously the crisis would be quite strong. But once again, all of this hinges on hypotheses that have not yet been verified. So we'll really have to see how oil prices behave in the coming weeks in order to have a more clear view on the situation.
Yeah, very interesting conversation. We spend most of the time the conversation talking about sub-Saharan Africa. What about North Africa, my friend? What about Morocco, for example, Egypt? Are you seeing some growth across that region of the continent?
Yes, I mean, more like Egypt, after its balance of payment crisis has been recovering. I mean, the country still has some fundamental structural weaknesses, but it is looking to solve them. And also, Egypt has been the beneficiary of a massive amount of external support, also because of its geostrategic position in the Middle East. But obviously, for Egypt, I mean, a situation as tense as it is now in the Middle East obviously creates concerns for Egypt. For Morocco, the situation, the economy has been very dynamic, simply because Morocco is very well integrated, basically into European value chains, and is increasingly integrated into value chains of sub-Saharan Africa, and it has been benefited from its high value-added industry like automotive and aeronautics that have been performing very well, of tourism, and also of services, especially financial services, because Morocco is becoming one of the large financial hubs of the African continent. And plus, they are preparing the next World Cup, so that's a lot of infrastructure investment. So that obviously is going to spur growth. But at the same time, Morocco is also obviously vulnerable to what's happening in the Middle East, not only in terms of oil prices, because Morocco is a net oil importer, but also on the supply chain disruptions that could happen, obviously in the Strait of Hormuz, but also extend into other critical choke points. And Morocco is reliant on maritime trade to be able to, trade with especially the European continent. So risks are there, but generally speaking, at least Morocco should continue to do fairly well because it has strong domestic demand drivers. Egypt has as well, but Egypt is, I think, much more vulnerable in the current situation, simply because of its proximity to the area where things are getting very complicated.
Yes, thank you so much. Very extensive conversation with you. Thank you so much for those insights. I wish you all the best. Have a pleasant evening there in Paris. Aroni Chaudhuri, Africa Chief Economist at COFACE Group.